Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. Secure Talk is brought to you by AdeQuest, your cybersecurity and compliance partner. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we have two guests joining us. We have Mr. Shannon Appelcline and Alex Preukschat. Shannon, actually, both these guys have just really a wide, diverse backgrounds. They're doing a lot of really super cool things. For example, Shannon is a technical writer, but he has a lot of experience in the blockchain ecosystem. He has worked for ECC cryptography innovator Certicom and Bitcoin leader Blockstream. He's also editor-in-chief for Rebooting the Web of Trust, and he's written about 40 different papers on decentralized technologies. In addition to that, he enjoys writing on a variety of other topics, including the role-playing industry, and he actually published a 4-book history called Designer and Dragons. I could just keep going because he's done a lot of really cool stuff, but I'm going to jump over to Alex here. Alex Preukschat. He's super passionate and involved with the different technologies related to the P2P economy. Alex was the global head of strategic blockchain projects with Evernym, and he's worked for or with a number of blockchain and technology ventures. He's also co-author of the first ever Bitcoin graphic novel, and that can be found on bitcoincomic.org. He's also written a bunch of other papers and involved in a bunch of other stuff. And I could just keep going and going on. Instead, I think we'll just get into the show. But these two individuals and some other really cool people were able to get together and collaborate or co-author a book called Self-Sovereign Identity, or SSI. And that's what we're going to be primarily talking about today. What is SSI? Why is it important? And how, as you as an individual or as an entity, can take advantage of some of the developments related to SSI. So, gentlemen, how are you today?
Great, thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's do a roll call. I'm Mark. I'm in Seattle. Where are you guys at, Shannon?
I'm Shannon. I'm on the island of Kauai out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
That explains the fan, I guess.
Yeah.
No need for that here in Seattle this time of year. So are you a permanent resident in Kauai, or are you, what do you call it, quarantining in Kauai?
No, I'm a permanent resident. We moved out here last January, about 2 months before the COVID hit, and then everything went crazy.
You know what? But your timing is impeccable. That's amazing. Great. I actually had some friends that they sailed from, I think it was San Francisco to Hawaii last year, and then after, and it's like a 2-week trip. But they got into Hawaii and then they had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And they're like, we've been on a sailboat. That kind of is quarantine, right? But rules are rules, right? So, well, aloha. Okay. And Alex, where are you at?
I'm based in Madrid in Spain, in Europe.
Wow.
And
okay.
Yeah, so the other side.
We got pretty much all the time zones covered then.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I before we jump into this, I just got to say, I looked at your backgrounds and your bios, and you guys have done some really cool things. I mean, Shannon, you're a technical writer. You're involved with cryptography, blockchain property rights. You have a 4-book history on the role-playing industry, Designers and Dragons. I mean, that's a pretty diverse set of topics or hobbies and interests and careers. Alex, you're also, you've been involved with the P2P economy. You co-authored a Bitcoin graphic novel, which I don't even know what that is. I guess it's a graphic novel about Bitcoin. Is that?
That's it. That's it exactly.
Yeah. You're in Spain. Shannon's in Kauai. So before we start talking about your book, Self-Sovereign Identity, how did you guys come together to collaborate?
If you want, I can share the background of that. Well, I started in the SSI space, or the self-sovereign identity space, in late 2016, early 2017, and I got really intrigued about it and started working with one of the companies that was really active there. And after a year, I was like, man, this is so complicated. This reminds me so much to Bitcoin in the early days. and it's so difficult to understand anything about it. It would be really, really good to have something that written down where everything is explained, like at least the high level stuff, so that that guides you through this jungle. And so I noticed there was nothing else, nothing done before like that. And I had published a book before about blockchain that became really famous in the Spanish speaking world, and which had that approach. And I thought, okay, let's try to do this in English. And Drummond, who was a colleague of mine at the time, and myself, we organized that whole thing with Manning, an American technology publisher. And then we organized the team around it. And Shannon, he joined us because Shannon, he's like one of the big guys in the SSI space, because he's one of the co-organizers of rebooting Web of Trust, and has been an author and co-author of many, many papers about SSI. So he knows the history from the very early days all the way to now. So it has been a great thing to have him with us as a co-author in the book then.
Well, that's great. And I guess that's just kind of a testament to the world that we're in right now, that you could be in Spain and Shannon can be in Hawaii, and you can collaborate and put out some really cool stuff. So let's talk a little bit about, not a little bit, let's talk a lot about your book, Self-Sovereign Identity. First off, I noticed that, one of the tenets or the premises is that there should be, in your opinion, a shift from the control of digital identities from third-party identity providers to the individual. And maybe you can give a little background in terms of why that's important, and how would you do that? Either one. You guys, yeah.
I think Shannon, you're the right person to do that. You've been there from the beginning.
Sure. It's funny that Alex said, hey, I started getting into SSI in 2016, talking about it as if it were an established field. When the truth is, getting into it in 2016, he was there almost from the start as well. He mentioned the rebooting the Web of Trust design workshops, which Christopher Allen began in, I think it was September or October of 2015. And at the time, the idea was, hey, we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, which was a very early way for people to, in a peer-to-peer method, exchange information in a secure way. And so Chris said, what can we do to commemorate this? Thinking, hey, in the next 6 months, we can do something exciting and fun that will kind of really get people thinking about this again. And one of the really important things about PGP was it was peer-to-peer and equally decentralized. There was not a central party. There were a lot of ideas in the air. Drummond Reed was right there at that first shop too, and he wrote a paper on DPKI, decentralized public key infrastructure. But I feel like it really came together the next March when we were in New York. That was the same March, April, somewhere around there, that ID 2020 came out. And ID 2020 was a UN related effort related to their SDG 1619. That's their Sustainable Development Goal, which said we want everyone in the world to have a birth identity that is theirs alone by 2030. 2020 was kind of getting along that. And that kind of came together with these ideas of DPKI. Drummond Reed, that time for Rebooting Web of Trust, had a paper that was called Sovereign Identities. And it all came together to say, hey, why don't we have these decentralized identities? Okay, so why is that important? It's important that you can control it. Because we were coming out of this UN-related effort, we were really looking at some of the world problems. And something that was really notable, big, and important, it still is now, but it was getting a lot of attention then, was the refugee crisis. And we were seeing all of these people that were having to flee their home countries because of various types of attacks, because of their religion, our culture, and go to other countries, and they usually could not bring their identity papers with them, because if they did so, they would be endangering the people at their home who stayed behind, because then it would be known, hey, some of your relatives fled the country, we're going to punish you. And so we were getting these increasing number of people without any type of identity and having to figure out what to do with them. And like I said, still a huge problem right now. That was one of these mini seeds, along with PGP, DPKI, Drummond's work on sovereign identity, that kind of came together and said, hey, why don't we have a decentralized identity, our SSI, self-sovereign identity, that people can control themselves. And then in a situation like that, they could have these cryptographically encrypted identities, which only they could choose to release. So on the one hand, they'd be able to say, hey, here's who I am, so that you can actually give me aid as a refugee. And on the other hand, it would be protected. So if a bad person got hold of it, it would be meaningless to them. So that was kind of one of the starts. I'm going to let Alex give some more in a second. But the one other thing that I wanted to say is when Alex was putting together the book on SSI, Alex and Drummond, what they wanted to do, well, Alex can perhaps correct me here, but one of the things they wanted to do is say, hey, what are all of these different ways in which SSI could be used that it would really improve things? And so to a certain extent, I suspect the answer to your question is the whole book. The whole book says why it's important. I can tell you that the topic that I wrote on specifically, I helped with a little editorial, but the topic I wrote on specifically was voting rights, something that's become much bigger, especially in the US, in the year since I originally wrote it. But when I originally wrote it, I said, hey, you know, we usually vote in person. This was before COVID. And there are some ways in which we allow more distant voting, where you can actually, you know, vote by mail. We all know a lot more about that now. And I started looking at it, and I said, this is kind of this balance between security and accessibility. On the one hand, the easier you make it for people to vote remotely, and obviously the next step beyond voting by mail is voting electronically, the more issues you have to at least think about with security. Doesn't mean you can't secure it, but it just means you need to think about it. But as I was writing this, I realized it's not just a balance between security and accessibility when we introduce something like SSI. SSI introduced this whole new idea that I termed agency in it. And it's something that I feel like isn't available in a lot of things online. And it's what I felt was transformative. And just to give a few examples of that, usually you can't go and say, hey, my vote was recorded. You can a little bit more now. We've seen some states in the US starting to allow it. In California, where I used to live, people could check, but in Hawaii, where I do now, you can't check. But that's just one of the ways that people can have personal agency that they couldn't via the old way of doing things. And I wrote a few other things, like you can actually give people the ability to vote for you if you have these identities, because something that goes hand in hand to it that we may talk more about here is verifiable credentials, where you don't just have an identity, but you have various things where you say this is true about me. And so I can have a verifiable credential that says I have the right to vote in this election, and then I can pass it off to Alex and say, I don't care about this topic, can you vote on it for me? Obviously, it's far from how a lot of the political systems are set up in most of the country, but something that becomes more possible with SSI. You can also change your vote up to the last minute. Estonia is one of the few places that has actually enabled SSI-related voting. They have something called an Estonian ID. You can vote online, and you can change your vote up until the day that the election actually is. I could vote 2 weeks ahead of time, and then I could see a horrible political ad, decide I don't want to vote for that person who released that horrible political ad, and change my vote. So these are just some of the transformative things, and I think Alex might be able to speak more to that. When they came in with the second or third draft of the book, one of the things that they said was, for each of these chapters, we want you to really go through, look at some of the main elements of your particular subject, and tell us, does it make things worse? Does it make things slightly better? Or does it transform them? And I think it really helped a lot of us to look and say, oh, wow, this is why SSI is really exciting, interesting, because it's transformative. So I've talked enough.
No,
Alex?
that's a great introduction. Thank you. Alex, you want to add on?
I think Shannon, he really explained it really well. I mean, it's just like to outline, as you might see during this dialogue we will have, is that SSI, I mean, the way we often explain it is might change the world as deeply as the internet at the time. Because in one way we have about how we explain this is when you go back in time and you think about the internet when it was created, it was really like the defense community and the academic community in the United States, at least for the Western networks, that started the whole thing, and was all based on a system of trust. And in that system of trust, well, defense people and academic people, they would exchange with each other information, they would share resources and stuff like that. And from the very beginning, there were like two key things they didn't think about because they were not a really requirement at the beginning. And those two things are like one, which is money, which was a big discussion in the 90s. It's like, okay, what is internet money? It has become another big discussion in the last 10 years with cryptocurrencies and all that stuff. And the second big discussion and that it evoked was identity, because of this trust system where different academics would know each other, like one from Stanford, the other one from Harvard, and whatever. They would know each other by name. They didn't need to verify, does this person really exist? Right. Because in reality, we have these machines talking to each other, but we don't know who's behind the machine. And that's where one of the key events of the community, which is the Internet Identity Workshop, got born, because they had a little dog with a mask as a symbol, because like from this cartoon, you don't know who's behind the machine. You would see a dog. And then the second big event, and that's usually how I explain it very often, because Shannon is being really modest, because it's true, yes, rebooting Web of Trust started in 2015, but it's all started with the Internet Identity Workshop that had already started in 2005, I think. And the Internet Identity Workshop, they had been developing many of the different standards and protocols that created kind of the identity thinking as we know it today. And then I personally, I love rebooting Web of Trust, because rebooting Web of Trust is like a smaller group of people with a very different approach that also make huge contributions to the development of the SSI community. While it's true, yes, it started maybe picking up a little bit of steam, but there have been many people thinking about it for many years. And Christopher Allen, as Shannon mentioned, and Shannon, who works really close with him, he kind of summed up the whole thinking around it, and came up with the term, self-sovereign identity, and summarized the principles and gave it a little bit of structure. And since then has become really big. So the thing we try to convey in the book is that since it touches upon everything, and especially on this big subject about, we're in this digital world where we cannot trust the people on the other side of the machine. How can we create this kind of environment where we can trust these people? And that's one of the possible. But this basically means in the digital economy, it touches upon everything. I mean, Shannon described right now the situation for the voting systems, but what we describe in the book is, how does this change animal rights? How does this change IoT? How does this change how nation states manage identity? And then we have a whole wonderful chapter from John Phillips from Australia, where he describes, how can I, as a business leader, as a business person, as a developer, create use cases? And then we can try to show them that. And did like basically four big parts. In the first part, we try to show in a general sense what SSI is about, so people can kind of understand it. The second part talks about all the technology standards, and that means verifiable credentials, decentralized identifiers, decentralized key management, governance frameworks, and other things, wallets. And the third part is more about the ideology and thinking where this is coming from. So that means cryptography, thinking from the 70s, the cypherpunks, peace movement and identity, the open source community, these kind of things. And we touch upon some other stuff. And then the fourth part is really about different use cases. And we will publish some of them on paper and some of them online, because use cases is basically, it's a never-ending story about all different applications that can be done.
Thank you for that. I'm still trying to get my mind around, though, right? In your book, you do mention the third-party identity providers. And maybe you can just give some examples of today, what we're using, and how SSI would replace that. Just a very simplistic example would be fine.
You want to go, Shannon?
Sure. Right now, if you have an identity on the internet, you mostly have it through some company. My Facebook identity is one of my most important identities because it keeps me in touch with my friends and my family, and it keeps me in touch through some pages with people who are interested in my Designers and Dragons books. Mm-hmm. It's totally controlled by them. They have the totally arbitrary ability to turn that off at any time. I could suddenly lose access to, the thousands of customer base. And even as it is, they've kind of tightened up control where I can only get access to them by paying them for advertising at any large level.
But even if you had your own identity, as long as you're using their platform, they would have the right or the ability, maybe not the right or the right to exclude you from that platform or community, right? So how does having your own identity help you in that situation?
Well, one of the things I'd point to, first of all, is the article that Alex mentioned that Chris Allen wrote. It's called The Path to Self-Sovereign Identity. There's a version of it in the book, I believe, and there's also a version of it online on lifewithalacrity.com, I think .com. So it lays out several things. One of the things that immediately strikes me when you say that is kind of continuity. I think Chris calls it portability and the path to self-sovereign identity. Something that I can do is, even if I become unable to post to Facebook, I could still say to an audience on a different platform, hey, this is me. Yeah. We've seen lots of bad people getting banned from Facebook and Twitter, and they've jumped over to various other services. So they're not necessarily the best example to use. But if there was self-sovereign identity, they could at least say, I'm the same person on this platform.
And you wouldn't have to be Mark on Facebook and Mark 777 on Twitter. You could have one ID, and wherever you go, that's where you are.
So the other thing to keep in mind with self-sovereign identity, SSI, is that it's not just about you having an identity. It's about hopefully everyone you're related to having identity. And so you say, I won't be able to use the Facebook platform, and that's totally true. But what I can maintain is if I've connected up to all of the people within my group of people, my cloud of people, via self-sovereign identities as opposed to Facebook identities, then I can still interact with them on whatever platform. I can still get in touch with them. Whereas right now, if I lose Facebook, I don't even know how to get to all of these people. I probably can't even look up who all these people are. And so it's not just about me, it's about this whole community.
And where do you store those identities? I mean, obviously you're not, yeah, I mean, do you have an address book? What do you have?
Ultimately, it's an implementation detail. But more generally, we've had lots of talks about kind of self-sovereign enclaves on the internet, storage that you have. Vaults, I think, is one of the phrases we're using them. At Rebuilding Web of Trust, we've kind of been working through this whole area. And so we've had several people who have been very interested in that exact question of how do we store this information. But if it's portable, if you look at like the GDPR, which came out since we've started working on this. It's the privacy rights in Europe, of course. One of the things you can do under the GDPR is you can demand, I guess, that a site give you all of the information you have in a portable format. And so It's entirely possible that what would usually happen in an SSI future is that I would usually have my information with someone else. I'd have the right to download it. I don't know how far California goes in that same regard. They're the other one who's put a big law out there. And then once I download, I could maybe upload it to some other service. But the 2 points would be, it's mine, and I can access it. And I can choose what to do with it. I guess that's 3 points.
Well, I mean, everything you say seems to make sense, and it seems like a no-brainer, right? And why wouldn't I want to have my own identity that I control? And it bothers me that Facebook has so much control, and I'm just picking on them, but there's basically any platform out there that they can shut you off. They have access to all of our data, et cetera, so on and so forth. But let me ask you: are the major impediments towards moving to an SSI paradigm? Are they technological, or is it more just resistance from people not getting their mind around it? What's slowing this down, or is it not slowing down? Is it accelerating?
Well, let me give a quick, and maybe Alex
Either
with some more.
Okay.
My quick answer is that we've seen it accelerating, at least on the developer side. Drummond, wrote the first sovereign ID paper in spring of 2016. By fall of 2017, we had a whole back room of people, 30 or 40 people at like our 5th conference. We're all really interested in putting it together. It since has been moved to W3C and is approaching finalization as a spec. I don't know the exact where it is there. So at least developer-wise, it's rapidly accelerating. I personally see the main impediments convincing people it's important. At least one of the papers that I led was, how do you tell your dad why self-sovereign identity is important? And bootstrapping. There's a real question of how do you get this from nothing to something that's widely supported. Alex, do you have more on the impediments and the how things are going forward?
Sure. Yeah, I think one really good, beautiful answer, I don't know if you guys had the opportunity to watch it, just this documentary, The Social Dilemma on Netflix, that I think gives a really extensive answer with many replies about why this is important, like as the world is today. I mean, in Shannon, he's pointing at it already, just talking about the voting systems and implications, but just the whole background about how our attention is being commercialized, and how not only that, it's not only being commercialized, we are not as free as we think we are, because the kind of information that we are being fed with is what defines who we are. And this has always been the case, but it has never been as much the case as it is today. And so if you get really, really bad food all the time, and then you might behave correspondingly, at least from an intellectual point of view. But that's one aspect. But it also reflects, I think, that in general, like beyond the geeks and freaks that into technology and privacy and cybersecurity and open source, which are usually the kind of people I kind of identify in the space that would be interested in something like this. For everyone else who's not, all these reasons are not really compelling, because for them it's like, okay, how do I get what I want in the quickest, cheapest way? Cheap is like free. I mean, I don't care. Yeah, you use my data, do whatever you want with my data. And I think the complexity has been there in the SSI space, that a lot of the SSI people involved, but that usually come from the privacy advocating, open source, etc. kind of people. They care about that problem, but most of the people, which is the majority, they do not really care. So that's one challenge, certainly. But then there's one big advantage, and I think there has been, as we all know, at least from my point of view, that's the case, a big power shift in the last 20 years. And I was just talking with a friend about it like 2 hours ago, and the establishment of the established money, for example, and the establishment as the governments, they're not really happy with the technology changes happening around the world. I mean, Silicon Valley as an oligopoly or monopoly on technology around the world is happy about it, because they made a lot of money with it. But everyone else is not really happy, because in the big game of power distribution around the world, the upcoming Amazons, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, etc., they are paying, because they're sitting there alone, extracting wealth from the whole world, and with very few people, and I think, first of all, they are very often like enemies between themselves, and we've seen like some companies like Microsoft that have seen a big opportunity in the SSI space. But I think not only because they see a business there, also for strategic reasons for themselves, but how they can weaken their competitors in the technology space. But then also governments, because governments, they see their position weaken all the time. I mean, you see this very clearly in the European Union, where they try to find big American multinational companies. But I mean, I'm saying, and big American technology companies, because usually the big ones come from America. If they would be coming from somewhere else,
Sure.
it would be from somewhere else. It doesn't really matter. So because they don't want to have these foreign companies that usually work on behalf of the governments, even if it's not official. But of course, they have to follow the rules of the nation states where they operate. And that's one thing. And then the second thing also, like if you take the European Union, I'm just putting my European hat on, they have a very bad position, because on the one hand, they have the Americans that are controlling technology. On the other hand, on the other side of the planet, they have the Chinese who are coming up very, very strong. And Europe stays nowhere. So regulation, as GDPR, as Shannon just mentioned right now, that's a tool like, okay, let's defend our turf. We kind of package it in a really nice way, say, oh, we have the best privacy rights. But as part of having the best privacy rights, it's also like, look, we're gonna try to control these guys because this is getting out of hand. And I think this is getting out of hand is a concern that all governments have. And it's a big subject, because I think I've been really critical, and I think more people have been also, like, it's really important about how this gets implemented, because depending on how this gets implemented, and I think Christopher, he talks quite frequently about this. I mean, these technologies, if you give them to the wrong people with the wrong ambitions, they can really become incredible tools of dystopian worlds and of suppression, totalitarianism. So it can get really, really bad, because we don't think about it enough, but identity, and the identity, what we usually talk about when we talk about identity, my thinking has been shifting on that too, is we're talking basically about our data points that are distributed in different silos. If you give someone that consolidated power to manage that for you, for example, I used to live in Russia, like 2.5 years, like many years ago. And in Russia, they have something in your passport that first says that your nationality. With nationality, they don't mean your passport. You have a Russian passport, but within all the Russian people, you have different ethnic minorities. And it says your ethnic minority in the passport. So it says, I'm whatever, Caucasian, I'm from Chechnya, blah, 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 and so on. And they have a lot of struggle in Russia around some of these minorities. Sure. And the other thing they have also, I don't know if they still have it, because I was there in 2003, they have a thing called Preukschat. And the Preukschat basically is a stamp in your passport that allows you to live in Moscow, St. Petersburg, for example, which are the most popular cities in Russia, because that's where the whole economy is. It's a very centralized state. And yeah, and if you wouldn't have that stamp, which a lot of people didn't have because they were like illegally in the city, even though they live legally, we cannot think about it because in our countries this doesn't exist. But some countries, they have that kind of stuff. Well, then you would get fined or tortured by the police, whatever might happen to you. And so if you but this is a very inefficient paper system the way we have it today. If you make all this digital and you give it all to the wrong people, then it can you can really do like micro segmentation about, you're an enemy of the state. We're just gonna disconnect you from the financial system, security system, everything system, because you're an enemy of the state right now. So they're all kind of wonderful, beautiful scenarios that might be created with SSI, or also all the opposite. So that's why this is a really, really important subject.
Yeah, you just kind of burst my optimistic bubble right there. So
that was not my objective.
I was like, this stuff is great, man. I love this. Sign me up. But now I'm like, I don't think so.
No, but that's not my objective. No. But I think the more you think about this, is like I've been in the Bitcoin space a long time, and people usually tend to talk only about the very nice, wonderful things, because usually people are very enthusiastic at the beginning when they start something. And then over time, as you learn about it, you say, okay, well, it really depends how we do it, because depending on how we do it, this might be used in some really bad ways. So that, like anything, like a knife, you can cut your meal with it, or you can kill people. But it's the problem is not the knife itself.
100%. But so here's the question. Let's say I have my own sovereign ID, and that I control that and I manage that somehow. That's mine for life. Okay. How does, just simple things. How do I get it? When do I get it? And what happens if I lose it? And what prevents somebody else from taking it? I mean, because my Facebook account can get hacked. and somebody could assume my identity on Facebook. It happens all the time. I'm sure you've got messages from your friends, and then like 20 minutes later, they're like, "That wasn't me. That wasn't me." Yeah. So walk me through that. How do you get it, keep it, make sure somebody doesn't take it?
You want to go first again, Shannon?
I mean, and sorry guys, this might be like really simplistic questions
No,
for you, but you know, when you're a mile deep in it, like you guys, for people who are just dipping their toes in the water, these seems like common sense.
No, they're great questions. So self-sovereign identity, SSI, we usually call it SSI now because self-sovereign has some other implications that have nothing to do with what we're talking about in the US in particular. So SSI is a philosophy. It is an idea that you have an identity that you can control, that you can change, that you know what it says, that you can at least be aware when people put credentials on it. So again, to a certain extent, everything else is, yes, we need to figure out how to implement it, but it could be done in a million different ways. Most of the ways that we're looking at right now are cryptographic, possibly almost all of them. DIDs, are decentralized identifiers, are one of the main roots for identity. They're just kind of a really big number that you have. And these DIDs have things called methods in the specification, and each DID method describes all of the questions that you just asked. You know, how is it put together? So, for example, there is one DID method that is related to the Bitcoin blockchain, where you root your DID method in some cryptocurrency that you are holding. This you use the little bit of data that you can put into a Bitcoin transaction to point to a file that has more information, essentially. And then you update your identity by spending the transaction, essentially spending your Bitcoins. So then some of your questions are, how do I get that identity? Well, I basically register it with this cryptocurrency that I hold. How do I make sure I don't lose it? Well, it's all protected by a private key on Bitcoin. What happens if I lose it? Well, you'd lose it by losing the private key. And so in that case, you start falling back to how do I make sure I don't lose a private key for Bitcoin? So maybe you back it up. We have at Blockchain Commons, where I work with Chris, we have a book called Smart Custody, which talks about all of this type of things. And one of the things we say is, well, get a steel plate, scribe your mnemonic words for your private key onto that steel plate, go put it in a bank, and then do it again in a bank in a different state. Okay, you're probably not going to lose it then. We have other answers like Shamir secret sharing, where you can shard up your private key and you can send it to different people. So the Bitcoin DID, it's not really one that's in serious usage. There's ones in much more serious usage. There's Sovereign, there's Manu's, something one. Varus one, thank you. And so there's ones that are much more serious than that one, in serious usage intended for real world things. So that one is too. But I use that one because people might know what Bitcoin is, might understand what the private keys are. And so it gives an example where you can put it back on another thing. But in general, it's going to be, you have some secret, have to know how to protect the secret. You have ways to back up the secret. You want to be able to recover your identity by, for example, in the Bitcoin example, basically moving it over to a new transaction. Or you want to be able to reconstruct your identity by recovering your shards, as an example. So what more would you say on that all, Alex?
No, Mark and Shan, I was just remembering, because that's one of the key things, because before I was talking about the competition between tech companies and the geopolitical aspects for governments and nation states. But there's one key aspect, and that's basically the low-hanging fruit of this whole thing right now, which is, for a lot of companies, holding all this data is becoming really dangerous, because almost everyone is getting hacked. And so that's one big aspect. And it's not only that, I mean, that's making it expensive, but it's also this whole reputation problem. But it's also like a lot of companies, they don't want to have the data anymore, because has become a toxic waste. And also like, hey, if why even have to manage this? I can maybe externalize it. We can create new business models, new processes around this. And one example that Drummond would love to talk about it. I mean, he's working on a big project with the WHO, the World Health Organization, where they're creating COVID credentials for the world. And so for those kind of scenarios where no one is kind of willing to have the whole data stored in a centralized database, and where you want to have different systems to be able to talk to each other just because you have the same protocols. For those examples, SSI is awesome because it kind of solved these global coordination problems where many different systems will not be able to talk with each other, where you don't want to have someone to hold that central power because no nation state or no organization wants to give that power to any of the other organizations, or then say, okay, if we use this, which is decentralized, then we're all happy. And that's one of the things that we're seeing right now as this very current theme of COVID, but it happens with all kinds of things. For banking, like if you want to do KYC, AML, like know your customer and anti-money laundering processes for banking, then they say, oh, okay, look, I can save all this onboarding money now. I will compete on a different level. I will not be competing anymore on having walls around my customers because it's really difficult for them to get in and out and people are really lazy. Now people can move their banking identity out from one bank to another bank, and banks will be competing on a different level about how they maintain that customer base. And so it's an infinite space then, basically, and because it touches from this very strategic, power shifting, global vision all the way down to the very down-to-earth, business-oriented solutions that people need.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I'm in the process of setting up an investment account. I have another account. I want to set up a different type of one, and I have to fill out all the same forms that I filled out before. And by the way, I have to fill them out and then fax them or mail them in, which is like, how secure is that, right? You know, it's like, what could go wrong? And it's time consuming, it's repetitive. And of course, there's always one mistake on the form, which requires me to, rinse and repeat. It's just annoying as heck. But I want to go back to something that, one of the tenets of GDPR and a lot of the other privacy guidelines out there is the idea of anonymization. So you're right that a lot of companies are looking at data as a toxic asset, or not even asset, liability, I should say, right? And so what do we do with it? At the same time, there's value that can be gleaned from that information. So for example, behaviors or, users, what are people doing and where are they doing, etc., without actually tying that to a specific person, right? Just you could look at trends. And so if you as a company were able to collect data, but it was anonymized because it was all SSI, right? You couldn't see who the individuals were. But you could actually get, analytics related to behaviors, consumer behaviors, whatever. It could be immigration behaviors, whatever governments or large companies are looking at for. Could this be a way to kind of solve some of those GDPR issues? Because GDPR is very, very restrictive in terms of the type of data. You have to have a very specific business case, or if it's a government, they have to have a particular reason to collect the data and store the data. They have to notify the people who hey, we are using your data. Here's how we're using it, etc. I can ask for them to give me all their data back that they have about me. They can delete me from the system, depending on so on and so forth. Could this be kind of a way for these organizations to collect the data, but also protect themselves from the toxic effects of it?
I would say probably not, but the not.
Okay.
My guess is that GDPR
yeah.
would probably label a DID as personally identifiable information. We think that IP addresses are probably PII. I don't know. I haven't looked.
They are. IP addresses included. But I thought if you had your sovereign identity, nobody can see who you really are. Or maybe I'm missing
it depends on what you're doing with it. It may very well be totally identifiable. It may well be totally pseudonymous. But even if it's just synonymous, like Bitcoin is, that doesn't mean that people can't track it down. Now,
okay. So you aren't completely anonymous, even if you have your sovereign ID. It still can be linked to the natural person.
I would say that someone could choose to create a DID system, a self-sovereign system that is totally anonymous, that is all zero knowledge proofs, that there's no way to connect it up, and maybe they could do it all right. I'm saying it's not a necessary characteristic of the system, and I suspect not how it's usually going to be used. I suspect either going to be usually used with, hey, I want to prove who I am on the net, or hey, I want to have a permanent identity on the net, even if it's theoretically not connected to me. But like I said, even with Bitcoin,
right.
Lots of people like to say it's anonymous. It's totally not anonymous. It's been...
Okay, so and that's something I thought when I was trading in Bitcoin, nobody knew who, I guess they can track through the wallet, but walk me through that. How can somebody discover who I am through my Bitcoin transaction?
Through a mistake. But
okay. I'm sure I've made
two issues here. First of all, there are some correlation issues with Bitcoin. Their whole blockchain's there. You can see every transaction that's ever happened. I can theoretically look who has a little bit of money now and see every single address that's passed through. And so maybe 10 years ago, I posted to a forum and said, hey, if you want to send me some Bitcoins, here's an address. It's quite possible that there's a lot of discussion of good hygiene practice on Bitcoin, have a new address every time. Most people don't do that. And so it's possible if someone wanted to do a lot of work that they could track it down. It's possible that even if I didn't make that mistake, if, my best friend did, that it might be trackable to me. You start looking at groups, there's, all kinds of wide-scale stuff. So we say it's pseudonymous, not anonymous, and it's an important difference. Maybe practically, most of the time it won't be tracked down, but if you depend on that and it's important, you're going to get bit. The reason I said but in there is that I think that DIDs and self-sovereign identity, SSI, are going to be really great for companies that are afraid of the toxic effects of GDPR-related identity and other laws that, as they come online. And it's because I'm holding that information now, not necessarily them.
I got you.
I got you.
And that's where the difference is. Alex?
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Shannon. I was just at, like within the SSI community, they're like different, like any community, like it's like any community, you see all these people banging their heads because they're like, no, my idea is better and this and that and whatever. So you have a one group of these that I've been close to, they would probably argue that with zero knowledge proofs, you can really achieve it, that the data is completely anonymized, and that GDPR is not an issue at all. And then you would have other groups that they will argue, look, technically this is not necessarily, it makes it too complex and it will not work, so you still have, I think, like the SSI community overall is still in the stage, where these different community groups are pushing for different directions. So you cannot really talk about one single SSI technology. That's why we have a specific chapter about architectures that has been written by Daniel Hartman, where he tries to explain like the different approaches to architecture and what those type of considerations mean when you choose that. And then just to add on top of what Shannon made, which is all very correct about Bitcoin, it's all true like this, but it's also true that especially criminals, and that's what has been giving a bad reputation to Bitcoin, is when you use mixing service, and if you're technically sufficiently sophisticated, you can't really make it anonymous or anonymous enough so that they cannot really track you down. And that's the whole discussion. And I think, and this discussion is incredibly fascinating for me. Especially for something like your program where you talk about privacy and cybersecurity. It's like we always have this discussion about, and that's the we haven't talked about this yet. We have this big discussion about freedom. Really, it's like, okay, if we want to have absolute freedom for the people, and that their privacy is protected, that's really good. I mean, no one can argue with that. But at the same time, that means that anyone with bad intentions will benefit from this absolute freedom and privacy too. And then we, as a society, we kind of need to find a balance of okay, what is the right balance of that? Because of course you will have some people that will abuse that freedom or that privilege of having this full privacy, and that's a big discussion we have in the SSI community too. Because and the way I explain it in the book, or my approach to explain it in the book, I call it blockchain believers, or the systems of blockchains believers, because basically it all depends on what your own belief system is. And what I have identified, I personally, I come from the very hardcore decentralization kind of freaky type of person. And over time, because I've been working with other people that I call the DLT people, which are distributed ledger technology people, the value systems that drive us are very different. Because in the decentralized crowd, which is the Bitcoin hardcore free software movement people, they believe we need to avoid centralized power, because centralized power gets corrupted over time and will be abused. And because of that, full decentralization is the best. And whatever the downside of that is, that's what the price we have to pay as a society to avoid something worse than that. And on the other hand, we have the DLT believers, that's how I call them, where they say, well, look, I mean, society as it works right now is pretty good. And yes, there can be some improvements made to how the system is right now. And if we just make a couple of tweaks with a little bit of decentralization, everything will be good. And these people, very often, they tend to confront each other. But we see this in the crypto community or the cryptocurrency community. We also see this in the SSI community. But that's one of the big questions, and that's why we all as a society need to build a dialogue around those questions and see what the benefits and the downsides are of all these technologies. Because as we said before, I think we need to have a very present that they can create a wonderful world, but it can also create a dystopian world. And my hunch is over time now that the probability of creating dystopian worlds is always much easier than creating a positive world or something that is good for everyone. So we need to pay special attention so that we can get something utopian out of it.
Well, it's interesting because I mean things are moving so quickly these days, right? And it's our ability to adapt on the fly to these new concepts and paradigms. I'm reading Herodotus, who was we call him the father of Western history, but he most of his book histories, which can be translated as research as well. There's a couple themes that run through it, and one of the themes is Persians versus the Greeks. But it's not just the Persians. Persians is it's a king who tells everybody what to do, and it's all central command. And then you have the Greek city-states, and they're trying to get organized, and it's like herding cats, and so it's very decentralized. And this theme that goes through it is like, well, which one is more effective? Which one is more effective? You know, and which one is more adaptable? And sometimes it's not really that clear. But I think it's a theme that we've been grappling with for a very long time. But the need to accelerate our learning is super important. Just a couple more questions here. You in the book, there's I think a chapter dedicated to Canada and how they're enabling SSI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Shannon, if you want, I'll go for this, but I'm sure you have some comments too. This book has been written by Tim Boehmer and a colleague of his from the Canadian government. And the Canadian government in this sense is really, really interesting. It's so different to the United States, for example. Because in Canada, I mean, they have similar principles there, but in Canada, they kind of live this federated system in a very strong way. So they have taken up SSI in a really big way because what they are thinking, okay, we have the strong federation of provinces. We as a central government, we need to provide a platform to all of them so that they can maintain these privileges that they have right now in all the provinces, but at the same time have something that is efficient instead of having each of the different provinces creating their own identity systems, which is kind of what they have today. I think in the US it's similar with the DMV and all that stuff. But they're pretty advanced in that stuff of organizing themselves from the Treasury Department in Canada. So Tim Boehmer, he's one of the key guys that we call him like Mr. Identity Canada, because he has been there for a long time. So, and he describes the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, and the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework is basically a big framework that explains how you can integrate all the legacy systems, how you can integrate the different provincial systems, and how you create a framework where SSI integrates all that, so you have something that fulfills the SSI principles. And that's the key question, because not everyone necessarily wants that. In the Canadian case, the political situation and the history of Canada has created a situation where it's in the interest of the Canadian government to push for something like this. But then there will be many other states where say, well, look, come on, we don't need to have something that is self-sovereign. We are a centralized state. Everything comes here from the headquarters. I mean, many people mention the Chinese identity systems that they're doing, but we're doing this in many other countries around the world. And so I think Canada is really like showing us the way, at least in terms of what nation states can do. And I think in Europe too is very similar. We have a very nice chapter from Nacho Lamillo, who's a Spanish lawyer who's very, very much involved with the European Union. And the European Union has a similar setup, because you have the different nation states as part of this club called the European Union, and no one wants to give up the power. So SSI kind of becomes interesting for them, because okay, if we have this distributed system, then we can manage identity in a collective way.
I would say that Canada was one of our first great excitements at rebooting Web of Trust for a country that was really interested in pushing this idea. I think at the end of 2018, 17, one of them, we had someone out at our Santa Barbara workshop talking about a corp book, I think it was, that they were doing, which, let their corporations do all their registration and other information in a self-sovereign way online. But one of the things that's kind of surprised me, I said that bootstrapping was one of the main impediments we had. We've been seeing a lot of support from governments, like Alex was saying. All the way back at ID 2020 with the UN in 2016, we had people on the UN floor talking about self-sovereign identity when we kicked off the whole conference. We've had Canada. We were in Barcelona, I guess 2 years ago now, and the city of Barcelona was very interested. We were supposed to be in the Netherlands last year, but obviously that didn't work out. But it was another issue where the government was really interested in helping pursue this. So I hope we're going to see this increasingly.
Yeah. What I would add to this, Mark, is that I think that's a really good point that Shannon is making here, is that there's this difference about how governments look at cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and how governments look at SSI. Because the thing with Bitcoin is, at least in its ethos and how it started, the initial narrative was we want to decentralize central banks and commercial banks. And this didn't really fit really well with those people. And then there are some other things. So it's anarchistic in its kind of approach. It's like this very cypherpunky approach. I mean, like this whole cypherpunk movement, the way they started in the early 90s, came up with this, okay, we need to defend the people against centralized power. And because of that, we will create the technological tools. We will not only talk about it, we will create the tools. And Bitcoin, in that sense, was the creation of that tool to help the people protect them against inflation, about monetary abuse, blah, blah, blah. And in SSI, it's pretty different, because when you look at the SSI community, they don't necessarily look for the elimination of the nation state because they're abusing the power. The SSI community usually is more like, okay, we don't want to have abuse by these big technology companies that are commercializing the data and abusing the people because people are not noticing, blah, 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 and all the consequences that has. And they find a happy partner in the governments, because the governments are like, oh yeah, look, this is exactly what I want to do, by the way. And you don't want to stop nation states, so our interests are pretty much aligned. And then you don't have this whole speculative aspect that you have in the cryptocurrency space, which makes it easy because there's no discussion about KYC, AML, if there's money laundering or not. It's all about, okay, let's make these processes better and protect the people. And it's pretty much aligned with government interests. So I think, at least from the way I see it, there are always these kind of power structures about what each player is kind of trying to achieve. And in SSI, I think it just happens to be what is in everyone's interest, except for those big players that are kind of creating the surveillance economy as we have it today.
We know who they are, and they know who we are.
Yeah.
So, hey, gentlemen, I got to say, normally these episodes go on for 30 to 45 minutes, and sometimes around that time the conversation starts to peter out. We've been going for an hour here. I'm sure that we could go for several more because there's a lot of information to cover here, and you guys know it. I mean, it's a mile deep for you guys. So I really appreciate it. I'm going to put links to discount coupons for your book, Self-Sovereign Identity, in the podcast description and in the YouTube video description. I'll put links there. And I'm sure you have some if people want to follow you, like, are you on Twitter, or do you have a preferred social channel, or are you into that at all? Either or. Now's your chance.
You can see most of what I'm doing on GitHub right now through the Blockchain Commons repo. We're doing a lot of work on figuring out decentralized things that will hopefully help the whole community. And also through Web of Trust. There's some Web of Trust info repos too. And the last thing I would say there is that, hey, check out weboftrust.info, because we're doing a virtual salon in 3 weeks on February 25th, which is going to be our first salon since the pandemic, and a way to kind of see what we're doing on that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I would very much recommend that. I love rebooting Web of Trust, so would recommend everyone to join it to learn more. And yeah, I mean, I'm best pinged via Twitter. It's Alex Preukschat, my very easy last name, and
easy for you to say.
And and check out identitybook.info, where we will be uploading chapters of the book. And if you search for Ed Manning for Self-Sovereign Identity, you can find the book, and you can already read those chapters that are online already. I think like 10 chapters online, and the book will be coming out very soon in April.
Awesome, gentlemen. Sorry, I cut you off, Shannon.
Just want to say, Twitter's Appelcline. It's about the only other place I talk about self-sovereign identity. I talk a lot about my role-playing books, though, too. So
awesome. It's all good. All good. Well, really enjoyed having you on the show, and let's touch base sometime, maybe middle of next year or something like that, or this year. We're already into this year, but wish you guys the best in 2021.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having us.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity.